Hi, I'm Crissy, 6th grade humanities teacher at Abu Dhabi, UAE, and I'm going to start today by talking about Santa Claus. When I was 8 years old, I learned an important truth. Santa Claus isn't real. How did I arrive at this truth? For whatever reason that year, I decided to pay more attention to my presents under the tree, and I recognized Santa's handwriting. Beautiful, precise, traditionally taught cursive. It was my grandmother's handwriting, no doubt about it. Luckily, it wasn't hard arriving at that truth. But in today's world, distinguishing between truth and lies, fact and fiction, impassioned opinion, and undeniable evidence is really difficult. With unlimited access to information comes unlimited access to misinformation too. And getting students to understand the difference between the two is challenging, very often frustrating, but incredibly vital work to empower young truth seekers. What this looks like in my classroom, in short, is using a big focus question throughout the year. How do we know what we know? This is the looming query that my students and I reference nonstop in all of our learning in multiple different ways. To get students engaged with this question, I do a truth radar within the first week of school. I create a list of questions and project them on the board. The questions range from something like, how do you know your name, to how do you know what kind of music you like? There is complete freedom with the questions. Then I play four corners with my students. I designate the four corners in my classroom as truth points: family, social media, friends, and education, or what I've been taught in school. And for each question that's posed, the students have to move to the corner where they believe they get that truth from. So, for example, if the question is, how do I know my name? My students will move to the family truth center of the room. Where it gets really interesting is when the questions become more opinion-based. It's interesting to see how many students get their music taste from social media, for example, or their fashion sense from their friends. After a full round, I ask the students to sit in their table groups and talk about the activity. What did they learn from it? What surprised them? Why do they think we even did this in the first place? I then ask students to share what they'd like with the whole class. Following that discussion, I have my students do a short writing or verbal response to the question, what is true about me, and how do I know this? I repeat this same writing or verbal activity at the end of the year and put them side by side for my students to have as a keepsake. Then I present my students with the year-long question, how do we know what we know? Introducing such a big concept in this way is not only using the flipped classroom model, but it's really engaging. Students are able to interact with that question in a more meaningful way than if I just started off the lesson with that question. Once students have a good grasp of our focus question, how do we know what we know? We move that into the context of assessing historical thinking. Our first unit of the school year centers around the importance of stories and how often stories are untold or voices are unheard. To study this, we use the novel Seed Folks by Paul Fleischman. In short, Seed Folks is about a community garden that is started and nurtured by immigrants in a particular neighborhood, and how it brings everybody together and challenges their perspectives of each other. Before we read, we talk about immigrants and how vastly different their stories and experiences are. We also learn about the author of Seed Folks, again referencing the question, how do we know what we know? Or in this case, how did he know what he knew? By learning about Paul Fleischman through videos and interviews, we learn that he's a child of immigrants himself and that he grew up with a mother who did a community garden outreach with other immigrants. We also learn that he interviewed immigrants in addition to other research to prepare for writing this book. By understanding that he did his research before writing this book, it helps the students gain trust in him as an author and helps students trust the authenticity of the voices in the book, including the author's voice. Knowing Fleischman wrote this book on behalf of real people he learned about helps students answer with confidence, how did he know what he knew? Additionally, in Seed Folks, the different characters have different reactions, thoughts, and feelings about the community garden and the people that are involved. Reading a book like that with such a diverse cast of characters really helps students examine the incredibly important idea that their personal context for what they know or believe might be different from everybody else's. As we move on to our next units, Early Humans and Ancient River Valley Civilizations, we, of course, re-examine our focus question and what it looks like in an informational setting. We talk a lot about how we know what we know about people or places from so long ago. For this, we focus on tangible things, fossils, artifacts, geographical evidence, etc. That we also do a deep dive into the people who discover, study, and write about those things. One activity I do in our early human unit is I give the students facts about early humans, each from a different source. So I might put my name as a source, a particular archaeologist's names, the textbook, my dad, a YouTuber, etc. I then have the students kind of rate and rank the sources based on their credibility and discuss why they grouped them the way that they did. When every group is finished, we come together as a class and discuss their rankings and why they put the sources in that order. We talk about trust. Am I a trustworthy source on this topic? Most of my students will say yes because I'm a teacher, but I have to remind them I'm not an expert in early humans. I'm an expert on teaching. The conversation continues and eventually leads to them agreeing that the archaeologist is the most trusted source because they have first-hand information. We'll talk about primary sources. When we talk about the textbook being a reliable source, we look at the back of the book and the giant list of references, discussing in depth what each reference means and why it's important for helping us trust a source. After that, I introduce my students to the different lenses we will use to examine information for the unit: archaeologist, paleontologist, historian, etc. I then give each group a jumbled set of facts about each profession: focus aspect of the job, amount of experience needed, amount of education required, and have them try and match them up. We talk about the correct matchings and all the work that goes into these professions. Getting my students to understand how much work, education, and experience it takes to be qualified to make those discoveries really gives them a context for why those professionals should be trusted. This idea of trust and sources will be repeated throughout the year. For the rest of the year, my students will continue to question sources. Are they reliable? What makes them reliable? How much of an expert in this field is this person? And again, how do we know what we know? Or in the case of early river valleys, early humans, how do those professionals know what they know? Something else I tell students to do when presented with facts is to see how many times the fact is repeated in different sources. Don't assume because you read it once that it's true. Fact check. We constantly reference multiple sources to be able to do. Moving on to our book club units, all the books offered as choices are centered around different social issues. In this unit, we circle back to our first unit and the idea of unheard voices and untold stories, examining how power can override the way a story is told. In this, we watch and respond to Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk about the danger of a single story. This conversation is so powerful, especially in my context as an international teacher in a classroom of international students in the Middle East. To hear these students talk about how people have a single story about their own culture or religion, or even how they had a single story about this region before moving here, is incredibly powerful. It's one of my favorite parts of the school year. To share a space where young people feel safe to discuss their own prejudices or how the prejudices of others have impacted them is invaluable. This conversation naturally leads into the discussion of the social issues represented in the books and the importance of those stories being told. All of our books are written by diverse authors, and the books are full of diverse characters with diverse stories. We talk a bit about each author and their inspiration for writing the books, referring back to our first unit and the expertise of each of these authors. All of the authors have a personal connection to the books, so students immediately trust the authenticity of the stories. Then, after students have selected their book for book club, they read, analyze, and discuss a nonfiction article about the main social issue of that book and how real people have been impacted by it. For example, one of the books, Other Words for Home, is about a young Syrian girl who has moved to America. Students are given an article about the Syrian refugee crisis so they understand that while the book they're reading is fiction, it is very much based in history or present-day reality. Throughout the book club unit, we do mini lessons on each of the social issues, either by watching videos, reading poems, or using visuals to prompt discussions. To discuss racism in America, we use the Rosa sat so Ruby could walk, so Kamala could run, so Ketanji could rule photo. Each day is a different social issue and different activity, so even if the social issue doesn't connect to the books that the student is reading themselves, they can understand about the books that other students are reading. As an adult, when I reflect back on my schooling, I am painfully aware of how many facts I was expected to just blindly accept. Now, as a teacher, I want to break that cycle for my students. Whether it's questioning long-standing traditions like Santa Claus or the historical truths connected to our curriculum, students need to assess their historical thinking. Using the question, how do we know what we know, is a great way to continuously challenge our students in their search for truths. Thank you.